friends and acquaintances and our brothers and sisters in Christ, my mother and I and our families, thank you all for being here. Amos Alcott has a quote he wrote one time: to keep the heart unwrinkled, to be hopeful, kind, cheerful, and reverent. That is to triumph over old age. As he entered his 80s, James Anthony Palumbo embraced each new day with enthusiasm and childlike excitement about what adventure the new morning would bring him, or whatever project he was going to tackle that day. I remember on more than one occasion, I'd be pouring my first cup of coffee in the morning, and he would be putting on his hat and heading out the door. I'd say, "Where are you going?" He says, "I got to go to work." I said, "Dad, you've been retired for 20 years. What do you mean you have to go to work?" He would reply with something like, "The lady that lives around the corner, her husband died last month, and I need to go and prune that tree that's overgrown in her yard." Dad's entire life was a lesson to us. He taught us how to live by how he lived his life. He showed us how to honor God by his deeds more than by his words, by pouring love into his family, by being honest and being diligent. I'm sure he was the most honest man that I ever met. He spent a lot of time around church folks. I'd watch him listen to many of them talk about their Bible knowledge, their prayer life, their religious experiences. He never tried to play that game. He was always real, always himself. Whenever something real needed to get done, they would say, "We better call Jimmy Palumbo." I rarely saw the religious folks with a shovel or a hammer or a broom in their hand. But for Dad, working the soil or wood or metal was an act of worship. His tools were his musical instruments. He taught us to love the outdoors. He loved fishing in the Great Lakes, in his home state of Michigan, and exploring the nearby Canadian wilderness. Hunting, fishing, camping, dirt bikes, snowmobiles, boats, canoes, and campers were all part of our life growing up. As Dad grew older, he was happy as wood carving the birds he saw in the pond behind his home, or hunted as a young man in Michigan. We have some of them back here that everyone can take a look at as they came in. He saw the magic of God's creation in every field and forest, and he was filled by wonder every year by the colors of every autumn leaf. One of his favorite things was to take me by the hand when I was young, as we walked along the banks of the Au Sable River, and if he would see an ancient tree, he'd try to have us wrap our arms around it. And he was most delighted when we couldn't. It was so big we couldn't get our arms around it. He would tell me, "Just think how old that tree must be." Dad was full of love. He poured love into his family his whole life. As his body and mind began to fail him, my mom and I often commented that his spirit was still intact, still the same. In his last days, as he was stripped of his strength, his memories, and his vocabulary, what remained was the essence of the man: his devotion to God and his affection for his one true love of 63 years. There's the theme, really. When we tell the story of Dad's life, will it be a drama, a comedy, an adventure tale? No, really, it's a love story. It started in 1955, believe it or not, after a night of gambling. God visited my dad. He had an epiphany, hopped into his 54 Chevy, drove down to the Catholic monastery, the Capuchin monastery, St. Bonaventure in Detroit. He went there to pray. He told God, he said, I'm ready to settle down. Says, first thing, I want you to give me a wife. But not just any wife. I want one who's a good person. And who'll be a good mother. Literally, a few days later, a tiny little Sicilian girl, Vincencina Teresa Tocco, known as Zena, or also by her friends as Zine the Bean, was walking down Mack Avenue in the Indian Village neighborhood of Detroit and passed by an old gas station like you'd see in a black and white movie. And Zena comments to her friend, says, oh, that one is, there's a bunch of guys hanging out in front. Says, oh, that one's cute. Do you know him? Her girlfriend said, sure, that's Jimmy Palumbo. And my mom says, can you introduce him to me? And the rest is history. They had their first date the next day, I believe. And just a few days later, on their second date, he asked my mom to marry him. At first, she told him no. She says, slow down, buddy. We just met. But thankfully, after thinking about it for a couple of days, she said yes. She told me just last night, this is because he was a nice guy. He was a good man. She knew it instinctively, enough to marry him after a couple of days. Her father knew it. Her mother knew it. And all of us that knew my dad, we knew it. He was a good man. Of course, he handled the engagement the old-fashioned way, and he asked my grandfather, Vito Tocco, for his permission to marry his daughter. Lori and I are very glad that he said yes. So the decades from that day until now are the chapters in this love story. From 1955 to this last Tuesday, New Year's Day, 2019. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s are the chapters in this story. A story of Jim Palumbo's devotion to his wife and to his family. Every dollar, every double shift, every second job, every remodel project was to give his bride and her children a better life. He did everything for us. He gave everything for us and for others. I don't think I've ever met a more selfless man. In a world that seems to have turned its back on Christianity, complaining of its hypocrisy and insincerity, my dad shows us what it truly means to be a Christian. He gave us an example that honors God and makes Christianity beautiful and noble. He loved without holding back. He gave every last ounce of himself for his family and for others. If you want to know what it means to be a Christian, if you've considered Christ, my dad has shown you the path to walk it with sincerity, humor, and dignity. Final chapter of this love story was past Tuesday. Though his strength and memories and vocabulary had left him, he suddenly spoke and told my mom that the angels were coming to help him. Help me stand up, he told her. Knowing him, I bet he wanted to walk to heaven on his own. And then he asked my mom to come close and hold him. And he gathered the last of his strength and uttered his final words to his sweetheart. I love you so much.